Hi, my name is Brian Pagano, and I'm going to walk you through some API first thinking today. So when we say API first, what we don't mean is let's take a look at all the stuff that we've built and bought over the years and use APIs as a mechanism to catapult that complexity out to developers and users. Right? We know that there's a problem domain we have to solve for, and that's this digital value chain. And if we haven't solved for the entire domain, then we haven't really solved the problem. Now there's a good way to approach this and a not as good way to approach this. And the not as good way is to start from the back end and to think about how we can move that complexity forward to the user. The optimal way, empirically demonstrated here in the 21st century, is to start from the user, start outside in. It sounds simple, but extremely powerful concept in being successful in APIs. And think about what do the users need, what do the developers need, and leave the nuts and bolts to the back-end teams. Now, APIs come in three flavors. We don't always necessarily think about this, that there are APIs as services, APIs as interactions, and APIs as products. So APIs as services are what your teams probably think of when they think of APIs, right? These are ways of getting back-end resources exposed. This is what your applications are built upon because applications need these back-end resources. This is what your teams will be thinking of when you say API, and there's a danger there because you want them to be thinking of all the possibilities of APIs, not just how applications, web apps, mobile apps, device apps can get a hold of those resources. Right? Now, APIs as a service have a great foundation also in the cloud. There's a lot of successful businesses and models of people using APIs as services. There's nothing wrong with APIs as services. It's a critical part of how we do business in 2017. We just need to keep in mind that it's not the whole story when it comes to APIs. It's just the default way that developers are going to work with it. And before you even ask, I know you're thinking it, what about microservices? Well, of course, microservices are powered by APIs just like anything else. All these applications and back-end systems need access to the microservices. And of course, you want to mediate that access through an API. And frankly, even microservices talking to other microservices can use an API. Why? Well, it allows you to be language agnostic. You can be polyglot. It allows you to scale through environments much more easily if you it just intermediate and not hardwire those connections. So the second kind of API is an API as an interaction, or you could think of it as an API as an experience, right? And this is the kind of stuff that we deal with every day in our lives, where we're pushing buttons, seeing panes of glass. It's generally built by the front-end teams instead of the back-end teams, like we just saw. And so it's a different kind of API. It's generally not built for reuse. It's generally built for a single purpose. The mobile developers tend to want to wrap an SDK over the top of the API so they can also take advantage of the specifics of the mobile platform. And some people get a little confused about, well, am I exposing all these inner APIs? Nope, you don't need to do that. If you've got a mediation layer, like an API management platform, those outer APIs are all those mobile developers need to interact with. Those outer APIs will then interact with the API platform, which itself will interact with those inner APIs. Right? And the third kind of API, to understand the totality of the API universe right now, is APIs as products. And this one's pretty simple to grasp, which is treat the API like you would treat any other kind of product. Make sure you've got product managers. Make sure you're really taking design into account. Think about how security might differ here, and think about the metrics. Right? You're not just going to do this to impress your friends. You're going to want to make some money off of this. And whether it's money or growth or interactions or whatever it is you're trying to do, make sure that you've got those KPIs to measure it. We want the API program to be a demonstrable success. Now, these are the three kinds of APIs, but all APIs live inside of an ecosystem. And this can be a little counterintuitive. You can be saying, but Brian, that's not true. We're just doing some internal stuff. Well, your company, chances are, if you're like every other company in the world, are set up in departments and budget codes and lines of business and silos, and that in itself is an ecosystem. And most likely you've got partners, whether it's your supply chain or your wholesalers or IT partners or whomever. That's an ecosystem. And your industry, whatever vertical you're in, probably has its own ecosystem. And then there's the public ecosystems around that. So every API exists within an ecosystem. It's just that the three kinds of APIs that we talked about earlier behave a little differently in these ecosystems. Right? The APIs as services tend to be a little more internally focused. They tend to have some amount of governance around them. the APIs as interactions, this is whenever you talk to the Google Home or the Amazon Alexa, these kind of things, these conversationals, that's a perfect example of a purely API mediated interaction. And APIs as products, well, there's many models there. We can start with a simple, like it used to be just a buyer and seller, but now we have APIs on both sides, and now we're starting to get into all kinds of crazy end-sided APIs. An example of this would be, say somebody's trying to use the mind-body system to book a yoga class. It probably also calls out to Google Maps and other side APIs. Instead of being just a one or two-way connection, you're talking about a multi-tiered connection to make that total experience for the user. So I know this has been a fast introduction, but hopefully it sparked some ways of thinking about APIs first and the totality of what it means to think about APIs first. The simplest thing, if I could tell you just one thing, is think outside in. What do people outside of our organizational trust boundaries care about? And think about that first. Think about your particular API. Again, all of your APIs don't have to be in one category, but an individual particular API will be a service, an interaction, or a product. Which one is it, and what does that mean for your design? Right? Manage your APIs like you would a digital partnership and cultivate that ecosystem. Remember, every API lives in an ecosystem, whether it's internal or external.